Hello, we are Further, a human insights company, and we specialize in online qualitative research. And we're here today to talk about how to move your focus groups online using an asynchronous online community to still get the kind of rich insights that you're used to and you want to get. This is particularly important right now because we are in a COVID-19 world where face-to-face research is typically not possible. So we're here to build your confidence and give you tips on how you can translate your offline kind of traditional focus groups to an online environment. It's something that my colleague and I we've been on a personal journey to make that transition. We are proper qual face-to-face traditional researchers. I used to teach at the London School of Economics, specifically at the Methodology Institute, training the whole of the LSE in qualitative research methods at a time when this online research was not really on the radar. It shows my age. And I'm here with my colleague, John.
Hello, yeah, I'm Dr. John Whittle. So yeah, similarly, I've also been on somewhat of that journey too, from very traditional methods in an academic background, where anything that touched the internet was a bit of the devil about it, to moving into the digital online space. And really, what both Dr. Marie-Claude and I have done is seek to find how you can deliver, best practice and rigor in an online form, maximising the advantages and minimising those disadvantages to ensure that you can get depth and quality in your qual research, which is what we're going to talk to you about today.
So the first thing we thought we'd discuss is, why did you want to use traditional focus groups in the first place? Because the answer to that question will really shape how you're going to then use an online community platform in order to get the insights. So for a lot of people, a focus group is really a way of sampling attitudes and opinions quickly and economically by bringing together a bunch of individuals in a group at a certain time and place. And really, practically, the analysis is very much focused on key themes in any one group. And there's no real concern that's paid to group dynamics. So if this is how you normally do your focus groups, it's going to be very easy for you to transfer to an online community. If you use your groups, your face-to-face traditional groups, with a real concern for group dynamics, for how turn-taking is happening, how different members of the groups influence one another, this is something that you can also do in an online community, but it would require setting activities and creating tasks that are slightly different. And if you were doing your focus groups in order to specifically to tap into the nonverbal aspects of communication, so that can be tone of voice, body language, facial expressions. This is trickier to get out in an online community, but you definitely can also do that using videos and photos. But asking yourselves why you wanted to do the focus groups and how you can then transfer that to an online environment is a very good place to start. Now, what you gain, in a sense, from an online community versus a face-to-face focus group, you can still have your individual verbal and non-verbal data. So people can type their answers to your questions, or they can record themselves. And so you get to see the participants, and you can see them in their world. You can tap into group dynamics and create specific settings inside the platform for to control bias, to give some people the right to speak before others, to make sure, for example, that before somebody answers a question that you set to them, they are either enabled to see what other members of the group have said or not, so you can control bias in that way. You can also, in a way that is not possible normally in face-to-face focus groups, because they occur at a certain time in a hotel or a focus group venue, you can get insights from context. So tap into what people do in their everyday world, and when they go shopping, when they are at work, when they are surfing the web. So you can get a contextualized understanding that typically a focus group is not allowing you to do, but also a focus group takes place at a fixed period of time. Typically it's 90 minutes. And this is your window of opportunity as a researcher to get all the insights that you need. In an online community, it's equally a fixed period of time, but this can be a matter of a few days to a few weeks to a few months, and sometimes up to a year or beyond. So you can therefore really explore issues in much greater depth than would be feasible through a focus group. So it's not all loss, as it were. People tend to focus on the losses, but in fact, there are many things to be gained by shifting from an offline focus group to an online community. So, as you know, of course, a focus group is face-to-face, and it's also synchronous. Everything is happening in real time with people face-to-face discussing with one another. Participants, therefore, can think and answer in the moment. So their answers are much more spontaneous. So if you're tapping into immediate reactions or emotions about something, that might be a better approach. If you want to do that online, there are ways of doing it, but you need to know that it's a slightly different process. In a focus group of typically 90 minutes and typically 8 people, assuming that the first 5 minutes are introducing the topic and the last 5 minutes are about wrapping up and summarizing and managing incentives, you're left with 80 minutes of discussion, which divided by 8 people gives you about 10 minutes of data per person per group. And within that, that's an average, but of course we all know that there's a danger of dominant responses and of some passive contributors. With all the best will in the world, this is very difficult to control consistently, which means that some of your answers are inevitably going to remain unanswered or dominated by some more talkative participants. In an online community, which is all happening asynchronously, which means not at the same time, so it's not a live interaction unlike a live focus group. It's you set questions or activities over a period of time, and you give your participants a few days maybe to answer your questions. So they have much more time to consider their answers. They have to articulate their answers, often in writing. So it's a deeper consideration, basically. It's more thoughtful answers, which sometimes is not suitable for a research project. So you need to be mindful of that. Participants have much greater control over confidentiality and privacy, so that they can at any point answer in private and not share a concern with everybody else. There are cost savings in terms of venue hire, transcription fees, but also travel and overnight stay transport, etc. Both the stimuli that are used by the research team and the responses from the participants can be done in a multimedia format, which is not doable typically in a focus group. And what I find really, really valuable as a researcher is the fact that you can segment your participants, both at the point of allocating an activity to them and at the point of analyzing all the data that you are gathering. Whereas in a typical focus group, it's very rare that, from my experience anyway, I might be different, but it's very rare that within a focus group, you will analyze differences by participants, right, in a systematic way in terms of age, gender, ethnicity, whatever demographic or attitudinal or psychographic variable. So that's just kind of an overview of the pros and cons, as it were. John will in a minute talk you through the basic tenets that we've identified 7 elements of good practice. And so as you make that transfer from offline to online, we'll talk about that in a minute. And I will just kick off with something that you may already be very familiar with. So the first thing to think about is the flow. And this is a consideration you would have in a normal face-to-face focus group. It's how you're going to essentially bring your 8 or 10 individuals together and turn them into a group, a proper group in the psychological sense of working together and achieving results together. So normally at the point of forming, when you greet people in the group, they are feeling a little bit anxious. They're still, they need to learn the ropes. What are the expectations? What are their roles and responsibilities? What's expected of them? So you have to do the same in an online environment. then, so that's about clarifying expectations and modeling the behavior as a moderator, as a researcher, that you expect from your contributors. Then there's storming. So that's the moment where people are still members, like individuals. They're not yet performing as members of a group. There's a bit of competition, a bit of struggling to establish who thinks in what way, and forming allegiances. And so that's can be a little bit fraught. You see that in the focus group. It might happen online, but you quickly move to something that's norming. That's about working around common norms, about collaborating, respecting each other's opinions and differences, and really making progress. And at that point, the group becomes a little bit more autonomous from the researcher. It begins to perform on its own, to have its own dynamics, and you're trying to achieve that in an online environment. To reach the point where people are performing, they are kind of really autonomous, they make decisions, they solve their own problems, they work independently of the researcher, and the community has a life of its own. It's very productive. That same thing as you would aim to achieve in a focus group, same thing happens online. And then there's the issue of adjourning, which is less complicated typically in a focus group. You just say thank you, you summarize, you ask for clarification, you give people their incentives, and that's kind of it. In an online community, if people have spent a week, a month, 6 months together and real relationships have developed, or sometimes it's been about a very sensitive topic, cancer, mental illness, whatever, you really need to find a way of, yes, celebrating what's been achieved, summarizing, inviting people to wrap up in their minds what's been their legacy, in a sense, to that community. But also, there might be a need to create a mechanism for them to continue to interact as a group. So depending on the project, the process of adjourning might be slightly more involved in an online community than a typical focus group. So with that, I'll hand over to my colleague John, who will talk you through the 7 tenets, the first one being the flow.
Yeah, and the reason why we share the flow in this form is that it will provide a bit of a contextual baseline. So, as Marie-Claude has brilliantly explained, this is very much the norm and probably a framework that many of you have used consciously or even unconsciously in your focus groups or your sessions. It provides us a good outline with when we're starting to think about how we translate that topic guide, that group, into an online asynchronous community. There can be no difference, as Marie-Claude has laid out there. There are similarities between each of those. And really, as I walk you through these tenets in terms of what we're looking at, with this understanding now of why we use those focus groups, the differences and what each one has in terms of those advantages, these tenets are there to help you begin to think about that translation of that guide. So as I say, in this one, it gives us the shape of whether we want to bring people together or split them apart, and understand the psychology behind them. So with this in mind, this provides us with our shape and our outline. So the next thing to be aware of when we are moving things along is what we call time and space. So typically costs for online qual, they are different. They're a little bit different in terms of you don't obviously have to hire facilities, sometimes travel costs. It means that actual general platform licenses are lower. And more often than not, that means that you engage in a different way. You engage over an extended period or a sustained period of time. Your energy and your participants' energy and effort is not and does not need to be focused into a pressurized window unless you wish it to be so. So instead, participants engage with your questions and with you and your team over a set sequence and a number of days. When thinking about your activities, this means that, well, as we've got written on the slide, you have more time and space. So do your participants. You can encourage your participants to reflect on ideas, questions, and experiences over multiple points. You could pose them a question at the start of a project. You could pose them something where they have to consider something and then return to it at the end with a time and a lived experience having gone past. For instance, if we're looking at people's well-being, there's a lot of virtue signaling that tends to happen. At the start of a project, you can ask people, what are you going to be doing this week? And they'll give you an answer. They might be, oh, I'm going to go to the gym 7 times a week. I'm going to run a marathon. And at the end of the week, actually go, well, how did it go? And, you know, they will report, well, my kid was ill and this happened, and actually life got in the way. You get really interesting comparative data points. Now, those are at 2 different points in a time sequence. You can also have it on a continuum. People can report on experiences and ideas as they happen over that time. So, you know, through using diaries. Or you can join them in a moment. They can take you on a journey with them. We love video safaris and, you know, cupboard deep dives. In an interview, if you ask someone about what they buy, they're going to give you a, in the moment, rationalized response. They're going to think about something and they're going to give you the best presentation of themselves or the answer that they think that you need. It's a little bit more difficult when you ask someone to record a video, unless, you know, they're really diligent in their prep. If they say, oh, well, I'm very healthy, but then they show you their cupboard and there's 17 packets of hobnobs, it's a little bit different. So you can, again, explore different types of data there. Some of you actually may have used online before, but probably as a supplement to your offline. So as a pre-task, you know, to warm people up to the topic. Again, you can build that in. There's not so much a pre-task as just a task in your flow. And finally, because of this time and space, you can get them to engage in tasks which normally you might hesitate to in person. In interviews and focus groups I've run, you rarely would sit there, you know, again, because of time pressures, and say, please draw me a timeline of your life, or create a product, or come up with your own presentation. Those are usually activities and events that you withhold for workshops and things like that. But actually here you can, you know, again, because people can go away, they are not on the spot, as it were, they can take their time to consider and reflect. You can get them to do those things. You can, again, thinking back to that flow, you could build towards a period of creation at the end where your participants have been exposed to stimuli and ideas and interactions and behaviors. And at the end, all of a sudden, they can come up with something and create it. So you're with them for more time, you've got more space, so have they. You can make use of that, which is absolutely brilliant. And we've got some examples here, just some visual ones. I mean, we'll keep it on the screen, but I would recommend have a look at these in the deck once you take it away. And you can actually look at examples of this in some activity guides that we've released. But these give you sort of rough, I say, examples of the words and the type of output that you can get from individuals. Now, as the last tenet points out, you have a huge amount of creative freedom in what you get participants to do. Because of this time and space, you can tap into the creativity and think about the best way of understanding, you know, latent needs and emotions. I always advise when I train other teams, I say, move past simple questions. Okay, we're not just literally taking our topic guide and throwing it into an online space. These online spaces can be rich in multimedia, rich in the ability to reach into someone's pocket in their lives. And as I've said, they allow different types of data to be gathered. So from immediate reactions, you can get that instant, oh, this is what I feel. You know, you could have that through an instant video piece, or a word association where you're asking people to spew words out at speed, or a click test where they're having to interact with a certain style of tool that you might have the platform. So you can get those considered accounts that you would typically tend to find in interviews and focus groups. And then, as I mentioned again, on the other side, you can get people to reflect. You can get them to look back at events, you know, way in the past or that have just very recently happened. Now, many platforms that you use will have a host of tools available for you to use, which make your life even easier. You know, heat maps are really good for using projectives or presenting people with an option where they don't have to be verbal. As I've said, quick fire responses, anything where you're providing people with a list of options they have to quickly choose from. Or if you want to understand relative importance, as we've got an example here on the slide, you can use a physical ranking and sorting tool. Again, the very physical act of moving something into place taps into a different mindset, as probably some of you have encountered when you've used, you know, sorting activities. You've got to really leverage the interactive and multimedia power of the platform to creatively engage with your participants. Now, the other thing that I like is that they're very egalitarian spaces. They allow your participants to select the best way that they can respond. So if you're, you know, speaking to a group who maybe traditionally aren't good at verbalizing their thoughts, who aren't very good at rationalizing or condensing all of that experience through their mouth, online spaces can allow them to participate with text. They could do a document, they could draw, you know, they might do a video, but they might have written a script for the video, which I love seeing, or they might have done something a little bit more spontaneous. In a time where emotion is very heightened at the minute, and where people are, you know, sometimes on the defensive or the reactive, Online spaces offer an element and an ability for people to express themselves on their terms, which I think brands really need, because it, again, allows them to connect directly. And these spaces also remove many of the physical cues that can be present that can influence conversation, gender, physicality, tone, things like that. People have, again, more control of how they express themselves, but you'd be surprised at what you learn from sort of the way that they choose to do that. Now, when you're thinking about your task and when you're translating that task online, one of the biggest key considerations is thinking about the type of data that you want to get or that you can get from a platform. One of the great things about online research is that you get a lot of data. Text answers are there immediately. You don't need transcription. Video and photo content arrive seamlessly, and other documents and files can be shared at the drop of a hat. The challenging thing about online qual is that you also get a lot of data. It's always worth knowing roughly what form of response your activity will produce or ask for, and also really what form is best suited to you, your team, and your client. A classic case of this is video. It sounds great. Clients love video. You have the consumer in the boardroom. But unless you have the budget for auto transcription and editing, video can become incredibly time consuming for the team. Even one task with a 5-minute video across 30 participants ends up creating 150 minutes of footage to sift through, something almost as laborious as the Fellowship of the Ring. So it's kind of key to think about what output you want and whether the tool you're using can help you achieve this. So, sustained diary tasks where you're getting people to explore and capture their thoughts and feelings, minute by minute, you can make that more manageable by using closed-ended questions rather than just long reams of unstructured data. You can pinpoint feedback on adsets or products using pin and heat map tools, because again, people dial into a point, it delivers to you a visual output. If you do have to use video, really focus it. Set a time limit with your participants. Give them a structure, something like start, stop, and continue, or 3 points to a CEO. Again, something that will allow your brain, when you're analyzing this, to begin to make chunks of it, begin to manage the data. Know your platform is really the advice here, and ask your suppliers for help when thinking about your guide. For instance, at Further, we offer services for design and optimization, as well as free resources that allow you to get the best out of the platform. I love the title of this, Bring the Noise. As we mentioned before, online qual, like all methods, it has its pros and cons. Reaching people through their devices means you engage them on their turf, so to speak. This is fantastic. You can reach them at multiple points where emotions and decisions that are present are far more aligned, perhaps, with the occasions that your clients are interested in. What's always fascinated me about interviews and focus groups is we take people out of a naturalistic environment and we then ask them to reflect on things outside of that room and to give us an account of it, which I've always suggested is slightly non-naturalistic. Online communities, again, because you're in their pocket, you're in their homes, means that you can be right there. Now, the downside of that is that you are contending with other distractions that might be present. There isn't the same social pressure, etiquette, or expectation that might be present during an interview or focus group. I mean, sometimes there's not even always the same focus. So many traditional or synchronous methods really rely on the researcher's ability to bring out and engage, with a certain amount of energy. Charisma is one of the biggest powerful tools in the quality's arsenal, and we use it to get people to think differently. With online qual, you are rarely present when someone engages with your task or activity. So this means that you need to make sure that your project, and specifically your questions, they bring that same energy. Think about your audience, your purpose, and make sure your tone of voice and language is right. Empower where you need to get participants to step outside of their shell. Use humor where possible. Even just use formatting tools to embolden or italicize important parts of your instructions. Ultimately, the job of your activity is to provide the opening part of your conversation online. It needs to do as good a job, if not better, than you might when delivering an open question. Now, of course, you can follow up with probes and questions. It's qual research after all, but it is always important to start off your conversation on the right foot. A little side tip here is, use welcome videos or visual stimulus. It's a great way to introduce yourself and your project and show that there is someone else on the other side of the computer that is paying attention. Participants aren't in a void. They are accountable to someone else, just in the same way they would be accountable in a focus group or an interview. Now, linked to this last point around the importance of your activity wording, it's crucial that your tasks are clear in their intention. And this sounds really obvious, but you would be surprised at the number of long-winded activities that you see online. There's a challenge in being specific. One qual researcher I trained recently remarked to me that, you know, when you are face to face, you can throw pretty much as many words as you need to a participant to coax the answer out of them, obviously without leading. Now, your activity needs to provide clear direction around what you want your participant to do. As you'll see when we go through some examples later on, this typically involves telling them, you know, what's the objective here? What's the intent? What is the client trying to achieve? And what is the intent behind it? You know, if it's providing a framework around a diary or a love letter or something, why are you getting them to do it? And then laying out the details, you know, what are the step-by-steps that you need, and any real clear directions they then have to go off. So, you know, do they need to take time? Should they answer it right now? Should they use someone else in this? Is this something that's going to be referred to at another point? You know, if you can bring all this together, it will keep your participants informed and engaged and empowered. As a rule of thumb, you're always looking to make sure that it's impossible to misread or become confused by your task. Always make sure that another team member checks your activities and that they're clear and to the point, without excess wording or flowery language that might alienate, exclude or put off your participants. As it's got here in very bold letters, keep it simple, keep it basic, keep it clear. Now, the final tenet is about fluidity. As with any topic guide, your discussion plan provides an outline of the questions and the insights that you're looking to explore. It's perhaps typically more structured. Participants will tend to complete it in a set path and a set way, but that doesn't mean there isn't space for exploration or iteration. All your activities and questions can be built upon and followed up, and you can, of course, as I've said, probe and, you know, ask extra things. But in the manner of iteration, in the same way a conversation flows and you often leave space at the end of a focus group for extra things that have been unearthed, it is key to leave yourself some space later in the project for a surprise activity. Now, by this, I don't mean a surprise activity that is a surprise for your participants to complete. You always want to manage expectations and workload clearly, but rather it's a task that you can add in nearer the right point, which might build on findings from previous activities. Make sure you coordinate with your team and your client to build in time for examination and analysis of the early data, and plan roughly how you might build this in, you know, if it's relevant. Or you can even split your projects into phases. You can have an exploratory phase, as we've got here in the bottom right. You know, we do a thing where we explore who a category audience is, what their understanding of a category is, what they like, what they don't, what their current behavior is. We then take that data away and we can work with a client to come up with some propositions or some concepts or some adverts that are then evaluated, you know, a couple of weeks later. And then sometimes we can even get the participants, even weeks later or days later, to come up with their own and solve their own needs. You know, really think ahead to get the best out of your project. So the final part of this is bringing it all together. These are all the things that are to be aware of, and they provide you with a basic framework, basic principles that you can use. At the end of the day, when you are designing your activity, there's a system I use called the golden triangle, and within this sits the perfect activity. When you've written your guide, your online guide, and you look at your activity, ask yourself these three questions. Does this activity achieve the desired insight objective? Am I answering my client's question? Does it generate an output that is easy for me and my team to use? So have I used the best tools available to me? Again, this is one to really check with the supplier, but also which you learn about with the more experience you've got with digital qual. And again, even more importantly, the last one is it creative or fun or engaging or really easy for my participants to engage with? Because if they're happy, they're going to keep engaging. If you hit all three of those questions, you've designed the perfect activity. So a lot of this is about knowing your platform, knowing your ability, and knowing your participant. I'm going to hand back over to Marie-Claude here, and she'll walk you through some activity demonstrations that we've got.
Yes, thanks, John. As we put this together, we thought for those who are not familiar with what an online community looks like, it would help to just have an idea of physically what the platform looks like. They're all very similar in a sense, regardless of the supplier. So on the left-hand side, you've got an example of a task that's called a word association. So very simply, you just ask people to write down all the words that come to mind about a topic, and that can be ideas, images, feelings, people, anything. So it gives you an idea of how one tool, which is called a blog, can be used for one purpose. The same tool could be used for a host of different purposes. At the end of the bottom of the slide, you see three answers to that question. So this is like examples of how the data would look like when it arrives on the platform. So for each person, you've got a string of words. And on the top right-hand side, you've got an example of how that can then be plugged into a word cloud kind of software embedded in a platform so that you can visualize these words easily. So it's just an example of how things might look like. So here is now a second activity. This was derived from a community that lasted for 6 months with about 60 women working across the sports sector. And it was about understanding their workplace experiences. So over that period of time, there were a number of experiences that seemed to be quite common. What we've done is we reflected on that and created a pictorial representation of the 16 experiences that we had extracted from all of these experiences that were described over the 6 months, and then created a stimulus on that basis that we inputted in the platform and asked the participants to put a pin on the 16 elements that best captured that they could relate to, and then to tell us why and give us an example of how that had materialized in their working life. So you can see that you can, the visual stimuluses has some pins on it, so you have little heat maps which indicate how prevalent a particular experience is. And then you can see a comment with a little icon for a facial expression. So obviously a negative experience. I don't know if you can see the little sad face at the bottom. And then people just describing why they have put a pin on each picture. And then I'll talk you through a third way of using the platform. And here's another example of a different kind of activity. This is more of a group discussion. So you can see very clear instructions. So welcome to the final day of this project. This is what we've done. In your response, these are clear directions of what we would like them to cover, things that they might want to consider. This is about creating a smoothie. So it's a more creative activity that you wouldn't ever use at the very beginning of a project, because you need to bring people in their minds to a place where they can be creative about a new product in a particular category. And then you can see on the right-hand side, on the top, in the top square, you can see the interactions between people commenting on one another's posts and enriching and improving the recommendations. So it gives you an idea of what physically the platform would look like. So I hope that's been helpful. We, of course, have lots of support available for you. You can look on our website and you'll find not only tutorials, but various materials and help with information about the specifics of the platform, various case studies. And I think something that people find incredibly useful, it's a templated, we have different templates, 3 or 4 of them, that are pre-designed task plans that embed all of our good practice in relation to very common use cases on our platform. So that's all, the templates are editable, so you can cut and paste and of course tailor everything to your specific briefs, but it's a very helpful source of information and good practice in design for taking your focus group online and into an online, offline and into an online community. So thank you very much for your attention. It's been quite a long seminar, but we hope you've gotten something out of it, and now we look forward to a good Q&A session.